September 11th, 1297. A commoner with a spear, a professional army with war horses and steel. By every measure, numbers, weapons, training, experience, this should have been a slaughter. It was, just not the one anyone expected. To understand why this battle matters, you have to understand what Scotland was going through. King Edward I of England, the man history would call the Hammer of the Scots, had spent years systematically dismantling Scottish independence. He forced the abdication of the Scottish king, marched his armies through the country unopposed, and installed his own men to govern and tax the population. Scotland was not just defeated, it was occupied, and the people were furious. Out of that fury came two men who would change everything. William Wallace was a commoner from the south of Scotland, not a noble, not a trained military commander, a rebel who had taken up arms against English rule and rallied others to do the same. Alongside him was Andrew Moray, a noble from the north who had organized his own uprising above the Firth of Forth. They were very different men from very different worlds, but they shared one goal: drive the English out. Together, they were formally known as the commanders of the Army of Scotland. On the English side stood John de Warenne, the 6th Earl of Surrey, Edward's appointed lieutenant in Scotland, and beside him was Hugh de Cressingham, the English treasurer of Scotland, a man so hated by the Scottish people that his very name had become a symbol of oppression. Cressingham was not a military man. He was a tax collector, but he was aggressive, overconfident, and eager to crush the rebellion quickly. That eagerness would cost thousands of lives. The English force that marched on Stirling was formidable by any standard. Around 9,000 men in total. Roughly 2,000 of those were heavy cavalry, mounted knights in full armor, riding powerful war horses. These were the most feared weapons on any medieval battlefield. The remaining 7,000 were infantry, including Welsh conscripts who had been pressed into service from Edward's other conquered territories. This was a professional, well-supplied, battle-tested army representing the full military power of the English crown. The Scottish force was something else entirely. Between 5,300 and 6,300 men, most of them infantry spearmen, commoners, farmers, men who had picked up weapons because they had nothing left to lose. They had almost no cavalry, perhaps 300 horsemen at most. They were lightly armed and lightly armored, but they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom. And they had two commanders who understood something the English did not. The ground itself could be a weapon. Stirling sat at a critical crossing point in central Scotland. The River Forth curved through the valley in a wide serpentine loop, and near the town there was only one practical way for an army to cross: a single narrow wooden bridge. Not a wide stone crossing built for armies. A slender wooden structure wide enough for just two horsemen riding side by side. That was the only way across. Wallace and Moray studied that bridge and understood its implications immediately. An army of 9,000 men trying to cross two at a time would take hours, and as they crossed, they would funnel into the marshy river loop on the Scottish bank, a low-lying boggy stretch of land with the river wrapping around three sides of it. Anyone trapped in that loop with an enemy charging from the hills above would have nowhere to run and nowhere to maneuver. The Scots took position on Abbey Craig, a prominent hill overlooking the entire scene. From that high ground they could see the bridge, the loop, and every English soldier who crossed. They had the perfect defensive position and the perfect trap. All they had to do was wait for the right moment. The English commanders knew the Scots were watching from the hill. They sent two Dominican friars across the bridge to offer terms. Surrender now, and there would be mercy. Wallace's answer came back clear and immediate. Tell your commander that we are not here to make peace, but to do battle, to defend ourselves, and to liberate our kingdom. The friars walked back across the bridge with nothing to show for it. What happened next reveals everything about the English command that day. Legend holds that the English actually began crossing the bridge multiple times that morning, only to be ordered back each time. Once, because the Earl had not yet finished his breakfast. Another time, because there was still debate among the commanders about tactics. Meanwhile, thousands of Scottish spearmen sat on the hillside watching and waiting. The hesitation and arrogance of men who could not conceive of defeat was already costing them their best chance. Some of the English commanders even suggested crossing at a nearby ford further downstream, which would have allowed them to move more troops across at once and outflank the Scottish position entirely. Cressingham dismissed the idea. It would take too long and cost too much money. He wanted a direct crossing. He wanted it done quickly. He got his way. When the English finally committed and began crossing in earnest, the Scots held their position. This was the hardest part. Watching the enemy pour across, knowing that every soldier who crossed made the English force on the other side larger, required extraordinary discipline. But Wallace and Moray understood the math. They needed enough English soldiers trapped in that loop to make the attack decisive, but not so many that the Scots would be overwhelmed. They waited until roughly half the English vanguard had crossed, perhaps close to 2,000 men, bunched together in the marshy ground with the river behind them. Then Wallace gave the signal. The Scots came down from Abbey Craig at a full charge. They used a formation called the Schiltron, a dense, bristling mass of spearmen packed tightly together with their long spears pointing outward in every direction, like a massive hedgehog made of men and steel. In open, flat terrain, Schiltrons could be broken by a determined cavalry charge or picked apart by archers. But in that marshy river loop, the English knights could not build up the speed needed to break the formation. Their heavy war horses sank into the mud and lost their footing. The riders could not maneuver. The advantages that made heavy cavalry so terrifying on an open battlefield simply did not exist here. The Scottish spearmen tore into the trapped English soldiers with devastating efficiency. At the same time, a key Scottish commander, some accounts name him as a knight named Richard Lundy, led troops to seize control of the bridge itself. With the bridge captured and held, the English soldiers already across were completely cut off. No reinforcements could reach them. No retreat was possible. Then the bridge collapsed. Exactly how it happened is still debated by historians. It may have broken under the sheer weight of panicking men and horses trying to flee back across. It may have been deliberately cut or broken by the Scots as part of the plan. Whatever the cause, the effect was catastrophic for the English. Thousands of soldiers were now stranded on the Scottish bank, with a broken crossing behind them and Scottish spearmen in front of them. Many tried to swim the Forth in full armor and drowned. Others were cut down on the riverbank. The English position dissolved into chaos and then into massacre. Hugh de Cressingham, the man whose arrogance and impatience had driven the English into this trap, was killed in the early stages of the battle. He fell from his horse and was killed on the spot. Later Scottish chronicles, written with obvious satisfaction, record that the Scots stripped skin from his body to make belts and trophies. Whether that is literally true or embellished by storytellers, it captures how deeply he was hated. John de Warenne, the Earl commanding the English army, did not stay to fight. He fled. And he fled so fast and in such panic that he personally ordered what remained of the bridge destroyed behind him to prevent the Scots from crossing and pursuing his retreat. The man sent to hold Scotland for Edward I abandoned the field entirely. The scale of the English defeat was staggering. The chronicler Walter of Guisborough, writing from the English side, recorded losses of around 100 cavalry and roughly 5,000 infantry killed. Out of a total force of around 9,000, that means more than half the English army was destroyed in a single afternoon. Scottish losses were comparatively small. The trap had worked almost perfectly. But victory came with a painful price. Andrew Moray, the co-commander who had helped design and execute this extraordinary tactical plan, had been seriously wounded during the battle. He lingered for weeks but never recovered. He died before November of 1297, just weeks after the battle that made his name. He was likely in his mid-20s. William Wallace survived and was knighted in the aftermath of the victory, an almost unheard of honor for a man of his common birth. He was named sole guardian of Scotland, the protector of a kingdom that had just proven it could fight back. The victory liberated most of Scotland from English military control, at least temporarily. Scottish garrisons expelled English forces from town after town in the weeks that followed. The broader significance of Stirlingbridge echoed far beyond Scotland. It demonstrated that infantry, ordinary men with spears in the right terrain, could defeat the most feared military force of the age. It showed that tactical intelligence and patience could overcome raw numerical superiority. It became a foundational moment of the First Scottish War of Independence, inspiring resistance and boosting morale across the country for years to come. Edward I was furious. He returned to Scotland the following year personally and met Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. There, English longbowmen shattered the Scottish schiltrons from a distance, and Wallace was defeated. He would eventually be captured and executed in 1305, but the cause he fought for did not die with him. Robert the Bruce picked it up, and Scotland would eventually win its independence. The wooden bridge at Stirling is long gone. The stone bridge that stands there today was built in the 15th century and sits slightly downstream from the original crossing. But Abbey Craig is still there, and on its summit stands the Wallace Monument, a Victorian tower built in the 1860s to honor the man who stood on that hill and waited. Waited with discipline and intelligence for exactly the right moment to unleash everything he had. Braveheart showed you a wide-open field charge, blue face paint, and Hollywood drama. The real story is quieter and more brilliant than that. It is two men standing on a hillside, watching a narrow bridge, and understanding something their enemies never did. The bridge was not an obstacle, it was the weapon. And on September 11th, 1297, William Wallace and Andrew Murray used it perfectly.